Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to this program. Tonight, I would like to discuss a subject um, that I find really challenging. This article is can be based on um, an article I received from a friend talking about Ian Smith. This is a prediction Ian Smith made in 1975. Have a look at this. The important bit is if blacks are to rule themselves, people in towns will walk on sewage until they believe it's normal. All the gains made from colonization will vanish, infrastructure will collapse, roads will be impassable, trains will kill people until they are abandoned as an unsafe mode of transport. Hospitals will close, farms will be grabbed, and nothing to feed the nation. Ian Smith said this in 1975, November 1975. Zimbabwe gained its independence in 1980. And now, 43 years later, I think the evidence on the ground shows that what he said was correct. Most of Zimbabwe's infrastructures all but collapsed. The economy is in ruins. And millions of our people are now living in abject poverty. This is the reality that we in Zimbabwe are facing. Tonight, I'm not so much interested in discussing whether or not Ian Smith was right, but in discussing if he was right, would we admit it? Would most blacks out there admit it? And I be honest, I think most blacks, even with all the evidence before them, still do not want to admit it. This is the tragedy of Zimbabwe, I believe. My father, one of his favorite sayings was kudzidza akuperi, kunopera nokufa. Roughly translated is one does not stop learning, only the dead have stopped learning. It's a Shona adage that has stayed with me. Of course, one has got to have the humility to accept that he has made a mistake, because making mistakes is an integral part of learning. But one has got to have that humility to say, yes, I've made a mistake, i.e., go into a situation with an open mind. Always go into a situation with an open mind. So why is it that even before independence, most blacks dismissed that remark by Ian Smith as sheer propaganda and racism at its worst? I'll be honest with you, I was one of them who did that as well. out of sheer pride. As a black person, here was Ian Smith being a white supremacist, saying that blacks are incapable of ruling themselves. But I think as somebody with an open mind, one has got to say, even then, before independence, one has got to say, well, could he be right? Could there be signs, even then, to point to this problem that blacks are incapable of ruling themselves? And I believe those signs were there. To go back to what my father was saying, rejecting that prediction out of hand without looking at whether or not, as a people, blacks were willing to accept making mistakes, would go into a situation with an open mind, willing to be educated, willing to make a mistake and accept that they've made a mistake, was important. But rejecting it out of hand clearly showed that one was not willing to go into a situation like that with an open mind. And so, even now, 43 years after independence, with the economy in total ruins, I think it is fair to say that some people still refuse to accept the facts on the ground. They still refuse to accept that we have indeed destroyed most of the infrastructure that we inherited from the white regime. Our hospitals have all but closed down. Our schools have all but closed too. Education results in Zimbabwe have now become so bad that in 2019, a ZANU-PF member of parliament for Chirezi South admitted he actually gathered all the headmasters of the schools in his constituency with grade 7, Form 1 and 2, Form 3 and 4, Form 5 and 6. And he was open enough to say that the best performing schools in his constituency that year for grade 7, Form 2, Form 4, and Form 6, the best performing schools had a pass rate of 3%. 3%. 3 out of 100 students had passed. This is an education system that has completely collapsed. And to keep on pretending that it has not collapsed is totally meaningless. It's absurd. It's insane. And I think it is this reluctance to accept that the situation that we have failed that has allowed those in positions of power and authority to get away with it. Surely people should have realized that at this rate, when 3% of the students are failing to pass, this is a catastrophe for the nation. This cannot be allowed to continue. It is the parents themselves who should have been calling the headmasters and their local MP to say this situation cannot continue. They didn't. And so, yes, of course, he called the headmasters and told them, oh, read them the Riot Act. But what were they supposed to do? This ZANU-PF regime has underfunded education and healthcare for decades now. Most of our experienced teachers have left the profession. Teachers and nurses have left their professions in despair because of decades of underfunding. The schools are in a dilapidated state. Their salaries, their slave wages. And yet, the ruling elite have become incredibly rich. If that is not evidence that we're incapable of self-governance, I don't know what is. But to come back to the theme I was talking about, Ian Smith saw those weaknesses in Zimbabwean, black Zimbabweans, back in 1975. And that's why he was able to make that prediction. And it has turned out to be correct. The least we can do now is at least do something about it. We have made big mistakes. We should publicly acknowledge them. Corruption has been rampant in Zimbabwe. That was a big mistake. The failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections has allowed ZANU-PF to remain in power for 43 years and counting. That was a big mistake. ZANU-PF leaders themselves, of course, when they got into power, they tested power and they loved it. And they loved it so much that to give it up was unthinkable. And hence, the reason why they moved swiftly to impose a de facto one-party state. We allowed them to do so. Yes, at the beginning, they had the guns, but we can't say, Kuti, after 43 years, ZANU-PF's use of violence is what stopped Zimbabweans ending the dictatorship. We had the golden opportunity to end the dictatorship in 2008 to 2013. Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends were elected by the ordinary people on a ticket to implement democratic change. As their party name implies, Movement for Democratic Change. And yet for 22 years, they failed to implement even one meaningful reform. Not even one. We have accepted that. We, the people, have accepted that. It is shocking that 22 years after the MDC were elected and they failed to implement even one reform, many people out there still have no clue what the GNU in 2008 to 2013 was about, much less that the opposition sold out. That is also another pointer to our failure to govern ourselves. Right now, many people are still supporting MDC, and they see them as the only hope of bringing about change. What change could MDC, Nelson Chamisa and his friends bring? They are participating in these elections. They've been participating in these elections since 2018, knowing fully well that they are flawed, knowing fully well that they will never win them. For the sake of the few seats that ZANU-PF has been giving away as bait, we, the people, should have seen through that. We haven't. That is another evidence of our failure to rule ourselves. On the whole, every nation gets the government that they deserve. I think in Zimbabwe, we have got a government, the ruling party is ZANU-PF, complete with its entourage of over 30 political parties at the last elections. Of equally corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless opposition parties. It is ultimately the citizens' responsibility to get a competent government. I think we have not taken that responsibility with the seriousness it deserves. We have made mistakes. We have been very slow to acknowledge that we made mistakes. In some cases, it's out of misplaced pride. But pride should come before a fall. If you keep on making the same mistake over and over again, I think it's insanity. We have had rigged elections for the last 43 years. And to go into these 2023 elections, participating in them, expecting change, is clear evidence of insanity. It's up to us. Those who do not learn from the past will be forced to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And that is what we have been doing these last 42 years. Like it or not, what Ian Smith said, he was correct. The evidence was there, actually. We are slow at learning from our own mistakes. And we pay dearly for it. It's that simple. It didn't have to be Ian Smith. Anybody else, even a black person, could have made that prediction. The evidence was there. Just that we didn't want to admit it to ourselves. And indeed, I think as a black person, to even admit it, you could have found yourself being lambasted by your fellow blacks, because we are not only unwilling to accept the truth, we become, our rejection of the truth becomes our solution to justify or burying our heads in the sand. But when we are where we are now, with the country in total economic meltdown, with the country very survival at stake, I think it is time to call a spade a spade. It is time to look ourselves in the eye and admit to ourselves that we have got a problem. Because only then can we start to meaningfully address the problem and solve it. I think we have got it in us. I come back to my father's favorite quotation: one does not stop learning. As a people, as a nation, that was an adage that was learned through generation of experience, to have an open mind. I think we can revert back to having an open mind, open enough to admit that the last 43 years have been a total disaster for the country, that where we are going is in the wrong direction, that we need to go back to basics. We need to go back to the rule of law. These coming elections in 2023, going ahead participating in them is the most idiotic thing that anyone can do. Because participating in the election in the way they are will only just give ZANU-PF legitimacy. And that's the most idiotic thing what we can do. MDC guys, Triple C guys are participating out of greed. They are after the few seats that they know ZANU-PF will give away to entice the opposition to participate. And I think it's time we looked the opposition straight in the eye and tell them in no uncertain terms that they have sold out in the past by failing to implement reforms, and that their participation out of greed, because they are after the 30 pieces of silver, is totally unacceptable. Food for thought. Thank you and good night.